civilizational way, which is to say that the forward march of history that Britain so thought it exemplified had evaded Ireland somehow, and that basically they only had themselves to blame for not being part of the vanguard of the progressive forward march of civilization. And finally, and you see that perfectly illustrated here in the editorial of the London Times in 1843. The Ireland and the Irish having great measure themselves to thank for their poverty. It's by industry, toil, perseverance, economy, prudence, by self-denial and self-dependence that the state becomes mighty, missing Y, and its people happy. Okay? This is 3 years before the famine breaks out. So the script of the famine is basically written in the British, from the British context. And of course, if you switched out the language of the state to the language of an individual person, that would also give you an absolutely perfect illustration of how it was that one would become a wealthy and prosperous individual. Finally, then, the third way of thinking of the Irish as a problem was to racialize them. Okay, very growing trend in the mid-19th century. Britain's become increasingly, as we'll see, obsessed with trying to figure out the structure of the world in racial terms and to create hierarchies of racial difference. And the Irish were not alone here. So what we have here is John Beddoes, a medic in Bristol, a doctor, who does this bunch of ethnographic work and publishes this book which eventually comes out as The Races of Britain in 1862, where he creates what he calls his Index of Nigrescence. Okay? And clearly, obviously, the blacker the colour, the more primitive and backward the people. So you can see that basically anywhere where there's a Celtic heritage, as in Cornwall, Wales, or in Ireland or the west of Scotland, is completely black. Okay, whereas the further east you go, the more pristinely white and Caucasian and civilized the people were. When the famine comes, then, it is devastating. In the years from 1846 through to 51, at least 1 million people die, and 2 million people are basically compelled to immigrate. Many, of course, to the east coast of the United States, some even to the west coast of the United States. That basically meant that the Irish population fell by pretty much a half. Total population of the country was about 6 million, and 3 million people basically are removed either through starvation or emigration. And you can see here in this map basically the distribution of the loss of famine deaths. So if you can see this, the darkest red is over 30% of the population. The point here of the map and the brighter red is 20 to 30%. Now, my point here is that the effects of the famine are pretty evenly spread across the entire island of Ireland, even in the north. Now, at the heart of this developing crisis was a figure called Charles Trevelyan. Now, you all know from the reading that you had to do from the link who Trevelyan is. So who's going to tell me who Charles Trevelyan is? Anyone know? Come on, peeps. Someone's got to know who Charles Trevelyan is. Yes. What's your name? Nicole.
He's
Mm-hmm.
Try to alleviate what was going on there, but his own personal saw the way that he didn't much to help the Irish anyway, kind of on the platform that they helped him.
Right. So, very good, Nicole. So he's Assistant Secretary to the Treasury. And who else knows where he worked before he ended up as the Assistant to the Treasury? Yeah. What's your name? Charlotte. Mm-hmm. And what else did he do in India? He worked in Bengal, and he introduced educational reforms. What other types of reforms? Right. So a big proponent of free trade in India. Also, interestingly, engaged in a whole series of public works projects there, both in the 1830s and then after the revolt in the 1850s. So he's a reforming civil servant, having this critical place at the heart of the Treasury as the Assistant Secretary for a long period of time. And he describes the famine in this book, The Irish Crisis, that he writes in 1848, the year after he's knighted for his work in the famine, as describes that famine as a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence. Okay? Which is not to say that this is an uncaring man. Okay? One of my favourite historians when I was growing up was a man called A.J.P. Taylor, and he's described Trevelyan, I think, in absolutely perfect way, which is to say he was a highly conscientious man, but his conscience never reproached him. That is to say, he absolutely, totally believed in the principles of liberal political economy, thought that they were morally right, thought that he was doing good work. Okay, even if, as we'll see, that work had profoundly devastating consequences. So he's a liberal, reforming civil servant. Okay, and he becomes very important later because he's behind the reforms that are introduced that transform the civil service in Britain. So, while Trevelyan is celebrating the fantastic work that he and the British government did in dealing with the famine, note that it's also published in 1848 as famine deaths are still unfolding and people are still emigrating. The alternative point of view is articulated by John Mitchell in this book, which was originally a series of published articles in two nationalist newspapers in Ireland, The Nation and The United Irishman, which he recycles in this fantastically titled The Last Conquest of Ireland, perhaps, published when he's in the US. This is a man who's deported for sedition, in large part because of his writing as a journalist about the famine. He's deported in 1848 to Bermuda in the Caribbean, or what you no doubt will refer to as the Caribbean. He's deported to Bermuda and then escapes to the US. What's very interesting, does anyone know what happens to John Mitchell in the US? Have any of you come across John Mitchell? John Mitchell becomes an advocate of the rights of the South in the Civil War, okay? And for the same reason why he's a critic of the British treatment of Ireland during the famine, he believed that against the imposition of liberal political economy onto others, okay? He believed that Britain was imposing free trade and free markets upon Ireland, on a society that wasn't historically ready for it, and he believed that the institution of slavery should not be should be upheld, because here you have an alternative way of organizing economic life. And basically, he wasn't so much a defender of slavery as he was the right of countries to define and promote their own economic policies. What Mitchell importantly does, and it's a huge contribution, is argue that the principles of liberal political economy are not universal. The likes of Trevelyan thought that free trade and free markets should be everywhere in the world. Okay? That these very ideas that they so profoundly believed in was true in all places. Okay? And Mitchell said that's rubbish. Okay? Actually, this is an ideology that comes out of Britain in the early 19th century. It works perfectly for Britain because it has this enormous commercial network. It has this enormous manufacturing base. Free trade works to its advantage. Okay? But for other countries, you need to have a different economic approach. And it was an argument that the German political economist Friedrich List also had promoted in the early 1840s. What that does, what that helps do, is catalyze a new approach to political economy, a more historically minded political economy that develops in Ireland with the economist Cliff Leslie, in Britain with the figure of Arnold Toynbee in the 1870s, and in India, as you'll see in a couple of weeks, through the work of Dutt and Renand. In other words, there's a whole group of political economists who begin to say, no, look, we can't think of free markets and free trade as being true in all contexts. Okay? And it's a form, if you like, of imperialism to suggest that what you believe in, everybody else should have to practice in societies and economies in quite different conditions. What Mitchell also does, the other great contribution of his The Last Conquest, is to define the nationalist take on the famine. And it's summarized in this quote: "The Almighty indeed sent the potato blight." So the potato blight that began the famine was clearly a natural calamity, but it was the English who created the famine. And that's the key thing, that the potato blight didn't have to turn to a famine, but it was the English imposition of the principles of liberal political economy and its handling of that crisis that turned the blight into a famine. And a famine, he suggested, that was willfully orchestrated to restructure Irish land and society. There are several features to his argument. The first was that the British used force to keep food exports open, and that they used the military to defend those exports. So this is a very famous print of the British military defending ships upon which grain is being exported out of Ireland during the crisis, okay, in order to make sure that the market is left free for trade. Now, subsequently, historians have said that, and pretty convincingly demonstrated, that throughout the crisis, imports exceeded exports. Okay, and estimates basically vary. Some go as high as 2 to 1. There are two things to say about that. One is that even though there may have been plenty of food available in Ireland during the famine, it was not distributed either by the market or the government in ways that found its way into the mouths of the starving. Okay? The other thing to say is that much of the imported food to Ireland was Indian corn or maize.